part of the Washington lobbying industry is just not his role, I think.
Yeah. And then there is the extremely short time of the announcement. Parties didn't have a chance to prepare. Everybody was caught short. Candidates weren't necessarily on the slate yet, so a lot of candidates registered at the very last day on the 13th of February. Is that intentional, do you think? Or is that merely poor planning on the government of Ontario's part?
Well, it's poor planning on the part of the other parties and us, if we care about our, because we knew it was coming. He's been talking about early election for a long time. Yeah. And I think it's also deliberate because he knew that. It takes a lot to get all these things lined up. And here we are. We're almost at the end. It just came and went like a flash.
Yeah. I know the smaller parties don't necessarily have candidates on standby all the time. There's usually a lull between elections when a lot of the parties are completely invisible. You never hear about the Ontario Party or the Libertarian Party or even much from the Green Party for that matter. It's always the NDP, Liberals and PCs that are in the news.
Yes. They're the standard. Mm-hmm. And the boutique parties are something else. And even among the standards, it's usually the Liberals and the Conservatives. It's been that way from the beginning. And those are the two that are likely going to, it's one or the other, right? With a few times when, here in Ontario, that one little time short time when the NDP was actually in charge of the administration.
Yeah. And at this point, up until the election was called, they were the official opposition.
Yes.
But I don't hear the media calling them the official opposition. They tend to go to the Liberals first.
Yep.
For an opposing opinion, when the Liberals don't even have enough candidates or enough members in the legislature to form an official party.
Yes. And they're all weak. All three of the parties that have seats in Queen's Park, other than the Conservatives, are pretty weak at this moment. It's not easy to explain why, nor do I have advice to say to change it, but it's definitely, and that goes to their advantage.
Yeah. How about the timing of this? The election is called in the middle of February, which is an unusual thing. We don't usually have winter elections in Canada for a very good reason.
For a very good reason.
We were snowbound for a good portion of this campaign. So again, is that a deliberate thing? Was there actually foresight and planning into putting an election in the middle of winter when voters would have trouble coming out?
It may have been inadvertent because they're also thinking about the federal scene, right? Because there's going to be an election there too sooner, or it has to be by the fall. Mm-hmm. And I think he wanted to get it in there before that comes around.
Well, the election wasn't due until June of next year, so it's more than a year in advance.
The Ontario.
Yeah, the Ontario election.
Yes.
Yeah.
The federal one would have been.
Federal would have been October of this year.
Yep.
Which is probably going to be called early as well.
That's what I mean, and he expected it to be called early.
Also, you think there was some correlation between a potential
Definitely,
federal election.
I think he wanted to get in there before the federal election happened.
All right. Yeah, there's a common belief that when we have a conservative federal government, we get a liberal provincial government. And so if the Conservatives are slated to be ahead of the polls for the federal election, then very likely Mr. Ford did not want to lose the power of the Ontario legislature.
That's the way, the pattern. It's a peculiar one when you think about it, especially since it's so polarized, right? I mean, these are peculiar people, the people who now kind of steer the Conservatives, the so-called Progressive Conservative Party. Mm-hmm. It's something completely different than actual progressivism or conservatism, as far as I can see.
When did that start?
The progressive, I think it started with the Mike Harris time.
Yeah, Mike Harris was the
He was a pioneer with his common sense revolution.
Yeah. Although I think it may have been in the books longer than that. I think we've seen that probably since the Mulroney, Reagan, Thatcher era, the late 1970s.
And on the federal scene when reform started rising up.
Yes.
and very much fascinated. They were obsessed with U.S. practices like a Triple E Senate and the referendum and the recall. Those are, U.S. Republican kinds of forms. And what we saw is a reversal. I mean, up till that point, the Liberal Party was always the one that took the American model and brought it here. And around that time, it started to reverse.
Right. So we've got a less progressive conservative party that's running. We have the NDP as the official opposition. We have the Liberals. We have the Green Party. We have some candidates from the Ontario Party in some of the ridings in Waterloo Region. We have a full slate of New Blue Party candidates.
Blue, yes.
Yeah. The Electoral Reform Party, Peter House, has put his name in the hat again. We have a Libertarian candidate, James Schultz in Waterloo, and an independent candidate, Christopher Noon in Kitchener Centre. Is that a good slate?
Well, again, a short election in February with very little warning. I mean, it's a time for all these people to come out and, you have all candidates discussions and that kind of thing. You get to see and get to speak. But now, particularly all the smaller and minor ones, they're almost invisible because we haven't had a chance to really, from their perspective, it's a campaign. But from a citizen's perspective, it's a decision-making process, and there are things we do, like organize those all-candidate sessions and things like you're doing here. That's what we do. Yeah. That's the citizens making democracy work. Yeah. But because of the timing and the time of year and just the general mood of the country, none of that was really possible this time around.
Yeah, I'm surprised at the lack of a communist candidate, a Marxist-Leninist candidate, Christian Heritage, all the other small parties. I mean, there's 20, 30 odd parties that are registered in Ontario. And, we've only got 6 or 7 of them in Waterloo Region. So,
and wasn't the last ballot, I think, for the federal, we had like 30 or something?
I think that was
But there were people trying to, that was a deliberate effort.
Yeah, that was a Kitchener by-election.
It was a by-election, yes.
That's right. And there was the long ballot campaign, which registered 13 or so independent candidates just to show how poorly our electoral system works, because a candidate that doesn't get elected has absolutely no power at all ever. Your votes for those candidates are essentially wasted. It's an electoral reform issue.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So these parties are left scrambling, and I think it's might be an indication that if there's not enough parties coming out to register candidates to run in the election, there's probably not a lot of people that are going to be coming out in the election. I hear that the number of advanced voters has been down to maybe 2/3 of what it was in the previous full election in 2022. So voter turnout is low, candidate turnout is low. I've spoken to people who don't even know that there's an election on. Here we are,
Yes.
a couple of days away from the election itself, and people still aren't aware that, yes, there is. They need to vote.
Yes. That's what it looks like. And voter turnout wasn't all that great before.
No, I think you got 40%, 45% maybe.
45 for the provincial, yeah. And the 20s, of course, for
the
municipal.
by-election. Yeah, and the by-election was fairly low as well.
Yes.
From what I understand. That's a problem.
Definitely it's a problem. And it's a problem that we think about the whole provincial campaigns and forget about that we are not, there's no provincial campaign. We never vote we vote in our constituencies. And each one is a race in itself or a campaign in itself, a decision in itself.
Right.
And I think people are so used to getting their information from centralized sources of information, and the campaign ads are, it's basically choosing between whatever campaign ads you hear. That's the nature of the campaign, and that's not a way to run a democracy.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of ads for the mainstream parties. I've seen absolutely none for the smaller parties.
Either have I.
Yeah. And those ads have been running since well before the election call. A couple of federal ads in there as well, largely for the Conservative Party of Canada. Haven't seen any Liberal Party of Canada federal ads or New Democratic Party of Canada federal ads. So I'm not sure if they're gearing up their campaigns yet. But there were NDP ads, Liberal Party ads, and Progressive Conservative Party ads, both on social media, on the streaming services like Netflix and Roku and whatnot, probably on broadcast television, although I haven't been able to receive broadcast television in a very long time.
I'm the same.
Yeah.
So I don't really know, like, you just get a few here and there that you happen to catch on social media, etc.
As far as the radio goes, we didn't receive any campaign ads at all this time. I had one query from one party at the start of the election. That party did not follow through in actually purchasing airtime. And of course, the smaller parties, the independents, the parties that don't fill a full slate of candidates across the board, they don't necessarily have the campaign funds to do media advertising.
No. How about in terms of people taking you up on an offer to come in and speak on the air?
Got about half. I made 24 time slots available. Today is the last 2 time slots, and we are here because they didn't all get filled. There was a couple of days when I had nothing to put on the air at all except some Canadian content music. Played a lot of Kitchener-Waterloo musicians. I'm sure they appreciated it. But the candidates did not all come out. Didn't get all the Green Party candidates. Apparently the Kitchener-Conestoga candidate, Braden, I forget Braden's last name at the moment, is a paper candidate. He's not actually running actively. There's no financial campaign officer for his election campaign. So he's not allowed to do any advertising or make any campaign purchases. Haven't seen him at any of the debates, haven't heard from him, haven't seen any publications, no signs in the neighborhood. And of course did not respond at all to my request for having him come in. Had one Green Party candidate decline. All the Progressive Conservative candidates declined. Some of them were nice enough to send me a note saying, no, we're not available for any of your 24 time slots because our schedule is just too busy. Got about half the Liberals, 3 of the 5 Liberal candidates, none of the New Blue candidates, all of the New Democrat Party candidates came in. So about half. We had about 13 episodes with candidates coming in to speak on the air.
And that's a service to them and to the community because you're helping us decide, right?
That's the idea. Have the candidates speak on their platform, get an idea of what they're really like. The campaign materials that they provide aren't always necessarily indicative of, the candidate's true character. I think you get a lot of an idea of how they'll be in the legislature, how they'll act as your representative by looking at their more social part of the social media, not the campaign part of the social media, but how they've been, how they've communicated, what they do in the community other than politics.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that a lot of the candidates, certainly the incumbent candidates, don't have a lot of time to do that. They're always in the spotlight. And a lot of the smaller party candidates are invisible because, lack of media attention. So giving them all an equal opportunity to be on there for a considerable amount of time. 25 minutes is a long time
That's
to
generous,
fill.
very generous.
Yes. And I would think that, especially the parties with a lot of party backing, the candidates with a lot of party backing, would have lots of material to fill 25 minutes of airtime. And I think most of them succeeded in that. Some of the smaller party candidates had some difficulty in filling 25 minutes of airtime because they weren't given a full platform, perhaps. They didn't have campaign materials provided by the party. It made for an interesting listen to all the different episodes.
Now, is that normal or that's unusual because of the short? I'm thinking about the short time frame and the fact that it's a surprise and all that.
Well, this is the first time that I've run
Okay.
this Meet the Candidate thing. It was run by CKMS back in 2018. And I was a candidate at that time, so I
Yes.
took advantage of that on the other side of the microphone. David Weber, who was another candidate in another riding, and I came in together. So we could trade things off each other, and it's much easier to fill 25 minutes when you can have a conversation with someone.
Sure.
So I made that option available to all the candidates as well. They could bring in their campaign manager or a fellow candidate. Some people took up on that, brought in a campaign manager or a fellow candidate, which meant that some of the candidates got 2 spots of airtime. Once as a guest for another candidate and once for their own spot, which is very clever.
And it's airtime plus those segments are available, right? You could listen
That's
to
right.
any of them, so they could use them for pointing to people. Say this is to have an opportunity to actually spend 25 minutes and explain to people why they should vote for you is quite an offer. I'd certainly take you up on it if I was running for something.
Yeah, I've released all the material that I've recorded as Creative Commons, which means that it's available for remixing, for reuse, cutting and slicing
Yeah.
and dicing. So that's a good thing for people to use in their own campaigns if they choose to do that. Of course, the opposition can also take bits and pieces out of that and use them out of context if they choose to do so. I'm hoping that doesn't happen. I'm hoping there's enough honor amongst candidates that doesn't happen. But that's a good thing to raise as well. But in the candidate advertising that you've seen, in the electoral advertising that you've seen, has there been a lot of negative advertising?
Definitely.
Yeah. Has there been any positive advertising that only advertises the things that the party stands for, what the candidate stands for? Has it been all negative advertising telling you how terrible the opposition is?
Well, I suppose standing up and saying, I'm your leader, I will save you, that's positive, I suppose, because you're just standing up and saying, I'm it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's still kind of misleading, partly because of the jurisdictions and all of that.
Mm-hmm. I think that there hasn't been a lot of individual candidate advertising, at least not in Waterloo Region, possibly in some of the ridings in the larger municipalities, possibly in Toronto. There might have been some individual candidates on the media, but I haven't seen anything from candidates here in Waterloo.
Now, I wonder what's a full campaign? I think the emphasis is knocking on doors, and people do that vigorously. Mm-hmm. I had the Liberals twice at my door. I actually met the candidate briefly, and then the next day there was a note saying, sorry, I missed you, because it was another one of her people that came by, right? Yep. And of course, the Greens, that's how they got to where they are in Kitchener Centre, with all that vigorous door knocking. Mike Morris, that's what he loves to do, even when he's here not campaigning, he's going knocking on doors. Yeah. But you have to do more than that, because that's not enough. I mean, one by one, I also hope, and this is why I think that your service, giving people a platform, and the other things that people are doing, like the Civic Tech, Waterloo Region has been doing a Waterloo Region Votes thing for years, and compiling material, organizing, telling people carefully how they can vote. Those are really good services, and what I hope we can get to is that we're making the decision together. It's a collective decision-making process. That's certainly how I try to think of it. I don't want to have my say. I want to be in sync with at least the plurality of my fellow citizens, so that and I'm willing to do anything. And that's not strategic voting. Strategic voting is trying to jig the system so that your vote has more weight than it normally would. This is deliberate, responsible voting. And I think that the Cooperate for Canada people, for instance, they were quite strong early on, but then again, I think the whole thing took them by surprise. But that's the direction they were going. But in that case, the emphasis is only on taking what's offered to us and making your decision, whereas this should actually be a process where there's give and take, where you have input. And I think it's great to have all those parties, and I think people should join parties, be part of them, because we're just totally, just live your lives every day, and then every 4 or 5 years, you go in and you make a quick decision based on what you hear on these little jingles. That's just dangerous, really.
I think a lot of people fall into that trap, where they only pay attention to electoral politics or just politics at all during an election campaign. And for the rest of the time, things kind of run quietly in the background. And I think we've got it fairly good here in Canada and in Ontario, that people don't have to worry about politics on a regular basis. I mean, there's no coups, there's no military marching in the streets trying to influence, how the citizens are supposed to think.
Absolutely.
So,
not gerrymandering like in the U.S. There's all sorts of, we're a pretty healthy democracy in that way, other than the participation.
Other than the participation, and possibly how the outcome of the election doesn't necessarily reflect the will of the people who have voted.
Well, right, because we departed from the two-party left and right system a long time ago. In the 20s, there were third and fourth parties, right? And it's even a broader spectrum. And I think that's actually a good thing. We're better off than the Americans who have stuck to it's got to be Democrat or Republican. Every now and then a third party, and then it just throws everything in disorder, right? But we haven't adjusted our system. Now, how exactly that adjustment would take place, that's a big question, but that just makes it interesting. But we need... And I hope that we can make those kind of adjustments. My argument is partially U.S. history is my thing, right?
Yes.
And they very early on had to. Their system is kind of an artificial one. They had to invent it out of the blue after having destroyed all their relations. But now they're stuck with it, right? And I think our system, which is more adaptive as time goes on, is actually more amenable to innovation and adjustment and improvement. We're not stuck with something that this room full of people invented in 17 whatever, and that's it. And they treat it almost like it's another book of the Bible, because what these founding fathers said, the original intent, what they were thinking, that's because they don't dare to veer away from it. So I'm hoping that we can go around and think about those kind of things too.
Yeah. What you're saying is true in theory. There's a flexibility for multiple parties, for a different form of government than what they have in the U.S. But in practice, it doesn't seem to work out that way. We have the same sort of adversarial system in our legislature and our parliament that they have in the States. We have the adversarial campaigning that takes place. And we have this terrible, terrible voting system of first past the post, where most of the votes in an electoral district get wasted, essentially, because they don't elect anybody. There's no representation associated with the vote you cast if you happen to not cast it for the candidate who is successful. And then the makeup of the legislature and the makeup of the House of Commons does not reflect how the votes came out in the proportionality of the votes. So.
And of the eligible voters, that whopping majority that Doug Ford had last time was with like 17%.
17 or 18%.
This is a very dangerous way to run a democracy.
Yeah. It wouldn't be so bad if the Progressive Conservatives had a minority government. Even if they did form the government at 17%, but to get a majority, an absolute majority in the legislature with only 17% of the approval vote is a terrible outcome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there was this campaign. I had KLG and Barbara Shoemaker on Community Connections yesterday morning. It's a campaign called Cooperate for Canada that was suggesting to party leaders, electoral districts, and candidates that the candidate who is best positioned to oppose the Progressive Conservatives should be the only candidate running in that particular riding, and all the other candidates should be requested to drop out. That wasn't particularly successful. I think we've only seen 2 candidates do that so far, one candidate out in Etobicoke and one of our own candidates here in Waterloo Region, Shafaza Esmail. I don't think she's actually dropped out of the race, but has endorsed the opposition candidate, Catherine Fife, due to fears of vote splitting, where we have one Progressive Conservative candidate, one right-wing political candidate, and a number of left-wing political candidates, the NDP, the Liberals, the Greens perhaps. And so the vote gets divided up amongst the Progressive candidates, allowing the opposition to get an equal number of votes, but a plurality over the Progressive votes. And so when that happens, the majority of the voters don't get the representation that they voted for. So to prevent that from happening, the idea behind Cooperate for Canada is to reduce the amount of opposition candidates and support only the one. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I actually went to some of those meetings, and I know some of the people involved, Kay, for instance, and I mentioned it earlier. It's just reactive. You're not actually participating in the system. You're actually taking what's there, using very dubious statistics, like whatever polls they have, because you have to go through 338 Canada, where they have, like right now, the race here in Kitchener Centre is touch and go between the Greens and the Conservatives. But to rely on that to make your decision, to make it sort of automatic, this is like, I can understand, because their argument was, particularly on the federal scene, and I think that was a bit of a mistake on their part, it seemed they were thinking primarily federal and Pierre Poilievre and what that would do to Canada, forgetting that we have a provincial thing to take care of too, which is of the same cloth as far as I can see. So they haven't really stepped into high gear, but it's... I didn't mind signing the pledge, because I do that anyway, because what I was trying to describe earlier, my purpose is to vote with the plurality of my fellow citizens, and that's not saying I'll vote anything but Conservative, but I couldn't vote with the plurality of my fellow citizens if it was that brand of, that new, that we never see anything like it. There's little bits and pieces that in that, but that new combination that's particularly sort of entrenched in the radical Republican, U.S. Republican mentality, and ours are very much the same. But I don't want to go into an election with that. I'll do anything but.
Yeah.
I want to work with my fellow citizens. And what I wish that it was really a deliberative process, and that actually there were other kinds of political organization than simply running candidates and being a political party in the sort of traditional sense. In some ways, that when the environmental people, for instance, put on an all candidates and they actually endorse a candidate, that's participating in that way. You're actually, and they're throwing that, if people who, what really matters to me is things that people care about, who are citizens in the positive way. If all you care about is lower taxes and you don't want to pay, that's you're off the spectrum as far as I'm concerned. But if you really care about something, I care about arts, culture, and heritage. And it's not even on the political spectrum. Nobody mentions any of those things. But I also care about the environment. I also care about housing. I also care about the drug problem. I also care about homelessness. All those things. And you can't cover all the causes, so you are inspired to be involved, or just your fate. Like, it was accidental that I got involved with arts, culture, and heritage. And it doesn't mean I have to sort of deprioritize. You actually, if all those people who care in their particular things actually made an effort to come up with some kind of consensus. Because if we all vote together, we'll get somewhere.
Yeah. I think that's the intended outcome for Cooperate for Canada, but I don't think they go about it quite the same way that you've just described.
No, and it's just reacting to the numbers. They're not even participating in the system. They're just saying vote so that you can defeat the Conservatives. I mean, that's negative. It's very totally negative to begin with. And also, you've actually dropped out of the system and you're only going with what the polls say.
Yeah.
And that's not even trying, right? You're letting everything unfold and then doing what you can in the end.
Yeah. For my part, I don't vote necessarily according to the plurality. I vote based on who will best represent me in the legislature. And my thought is that if Cooperate for Canada had been successful in their first round of convincing candidates to drop out of the race, they're actually reducing the participation, they're reducing the democracy that's available, because the voters don't have the same choice that they would if there was a full slate of candidates. If people drop out, you lose some valuable perspective. Now, from what I understood is that their thought is that the progressive candidates are all pretty much alike. The progressive parties are all pretty similar, with very little difference in their platforms. You know, same kind of ideas on climate, same kind of ideas on healthcare. Having been on the inside of one of the Progressive Party, I don't believe that that is true at all, that there are significant differences on the Progressive Party side. And so having a campaign to vote strategically, or as Scott Bietkowski put it, voting insincerely, voting against your best interests, voting against the candidate that you think will best represent you, isn't very democratic. It's reducing the choice for people. And that just doesn't sit well with me. The other thing that bothers me about the whole thing is that they're relying on the polls. I know that when I get a call from a pollster, I'm not inclined to give them any information at all. You know, voting is a private thing. None of their business how I'm going to vote. That's something that's entirely up to me. So while I haven't actually been feeding the people who have called for polls any incorrect information, I'm not talking to them much either. I'm not sure how accurate the polls generally are. I know that some of the polls that have come out in past elections have been wildly inaccurate. So trying to influence the outcome of an election on what is essentially flawed data seems to be a very bad choice as well.
I think so. I think that's the problem. Especially since those polls include the 55% of the population who aren't voting.
Yeah, and even more so, the polls also include people who aren't eligible to vote. You know, you can very likely have people who are getting called, who are providing their opinions, that aren't Canadian citizens, that might not be 18 yet, that might not actually be residents of Ontario. So those people aren't eligible to vote, yet still provide input to the polling numbers.
Yes. And I don't know how they do it nowadays, but it used to be, it was telephone primarily. And I hardly ever use my telephone. I mean, I have a mobile phone and not a landline. And because I don't have many places to go, I don't even use my phone. I don't expect a lot of interchange on my phone.
Yeah, still have a landline, but we never answer. We always let it go to the voicemail first. And so if it's somebody that we know and we want to speak with, we'll pick it up. That does not include people who are calling for polls.
No, I don't pick it up if there's a number and they don't say who they are.
Yes.
If I don't know who they are, well then, and then I don't even check the voicemail necessarily. I should actually change my message to say, send me a text if you really know it. Because voicemail takes a long time, then you get the whole message.
Yeah, and people don't leave proper messages. You know, a message that says, it's such and such, please call me back, is not a message. You know, I can't act on that. I don't know what you want. I have no clue how important this is. So I don't believe that the polling numbers necessarily provide any sense of accuracy, any sort of guide to go by. The election. The election on Thursday the 27th, that is the poll that counts.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. Now, I think where we differ is you say voting is private. I want it to be collective. I want us to decide together. And I think that's probably in traditional societies reaching for consensus. And that's what we've lost with this adversarial system that I think has been part of modern life. It really came around with the revolutions and counter-revolutions and all of that. And since then, we've kind of almost ritualized war, civil war, and that's good. It's kept us from killing each other. But it's also, I think, not healthy for a society.
You see elections as a proxy for war?
Definitely. It's not a proxy. It's a way of, it was a way of sort of quieting down the revolutionary impulse. Because, you know, the Declaration of Independence, you're right. If you don't like what's going on, you should rise up and start killing people. That's the rule, right?
Yeah.
And we've kind of ritualized that. Now, when we did, it usually ended up that it didn't really matter. I mean, the difference between the two parties, Republican and Democrat, were usually fairly minor. So you could do exchanges back and forth. But when there's such a broad gap between particularly what goes for conservatism nowadays and all the rest, then you've got a problem. And what I try to sort of put forward is that they've gone off the spectrum. If you treat them as the one pole and you're going to go against, you're progressive and you're giving them too much credit and credibility. We should push them right off the game.
Is that just in their campaigning, or are you basing that on their past record in the legislature as part of government?
I've felt that way since the days of Mike Harris. When that happened, it took me totally by surprise. And I was so appalled by just the way they went about it that it just changed my whole perspective. Yeah.
I think I missed voting once in the 1990s. Since then, I've been a regular voter, you know, to the point of being a candidate even. Never been very successful in voting for the people that actually make it to Parliament or make it to the legislature. You know, one of the reasons that I'm such an electoral reform advocate. It's difficult to make a choice, especially in this past campaign where we saw so few of the right-wing candidates, the Blue Party candidates, the Ontario Party candidates, and especially the Progressive Conservative candidates not coming out to debates, not coming out to interviews on the radio, not coming out to the Meet the Candidate 25-minute thing. And yet, as much as I disbelieve the polls, they're still leading in the polls. Or not, if not leading, at least coming in a close second. How can that possibly be?
I know. Yes, that's the baffling question.
Are there so many people so disengaged from the political system that they vote for, I don't know, are they voting for the Premier? Are they voting for Doug Ford? Are they voting for the party itself? They certainly can't be voting for the candidate because the candidate hasn't been there.
And where are all these people who are saying that? Because the people I know are people just putting a false face forward, and they're actually thinking along those lines privately. Because, or is it just that we move in totally different circles?
I don't know. Some of the candidates were parachute candidates. Rob Elliott and Peter Workington. They are both from out of town. One from Mississauga, one from Oakville, apparently, and. They're not even resident here. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but I would certainly expect them to get themselves known in the community where they intend to be the representative for the people.
You would think.
And so just not having them show up at interviews or debates is a definite indication to me that these people should not be representing anybody.
No. But I think it's related to the Republican attitude of the lying press. They don't trust anyone. It's all, and so they just stay away. They think they're not going to get a fair shake, and to some extent they're right, because if people come out and they care about the environment, and you go to an all candidates meeting, and you come there knowing that because of their record, it's on the environmental record, I think that the present government is particularly indictable. It's just appalling what they've done.
I was thinking healthcare, but
Healthcare too,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah. I don't know what can be done about that. Should there be a requirement that in order to be a candidate in an election, you have to have a public face, you have to be accessible to the voters that you're trying to get to vote for you?
No,
cannot-
you can't make a law saying you can't make people. We should just have it so that it's considered unacceptable. It's a kind of rudeness, right? It's
It is.
really it's what it is. It's an insult to us, the electorate.
Absolutely. It's I don't know. I would certainly not want to hang out and have a beer with somebody who's not a friend. It's and I'm not saying that all the candidates who have appeared on the radio, who have appeared in the all-candidate debates, that they're all friends. But certainly, I feel that I've got to know them a little bit better because of the statements that they've made, the positions that they hold, how they present themselves. So yeah, I'd probably have a beer with most of the candidates that are out there that have been publicly accessible.
Yes, yes.
That may be a good analog for voting. Would I have a beer with this person?
Yes.
So what do you think is going to happen now? We're 2 days away from the election. Tomorrow is the last day where you can still vote at your returning office if you want to do that. Advance polls were short and
remote. They were all in places that not any was close to a
really?
public transit.
Okay. I was lucky. I was able to walk to my advance polling station.
Okay.
But there's only 1 day left to do any sort of advance voting. Election day is Thursday, 2 days away. There's supposed to be some precipitation happening overnight from Wednesday to Thursday. That's not promising. It's either going to be snow or if it's rain, that could end up freezing and just making things even more slippery and slushy and miserable than they are already. What do you predict for voter turnout?
I think the turnout will be even less than last time, and the result will be, from my perspective at least, worse than last time, because all the indicators say they're going to get away with what they intended, and they're going to be returned with an even bigger majority than they had the last time.
Yeah. In Waterloo Region, where we have 1 Green, 1 NDP member, and 3 Conservative members, how do you think we'll fare in the region here? Same sort of
I think it'll
outcome?
probably be the same, but you can't take it for granted. I think the Waterloo and Kitchener, you have to, if you're going to support, you have to go out and make sure you vote, because it's particularly in Kitchener, touch and go.
Really. I don't know how the campaigns have been running in Cambridge or in Kitchener South Hespeler. I know that some of the candidates have been very active, out knocking on doors and whatnot. I don't know, from a northern Waterloo region perspective, those areas seem pretty remote to me. I very rarely get any further south than Kitchener itself. Any idea how the campaigns have been running for those people?
No, you hear very little of it. The interesting one, of course, is Wilmot, which is part of
That's the Kitchener-Conestoga.
Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mm-hmm.
And every indication says that it's not going to change. It's going to be the same. That was almost a parachute candidate, because Mike Harris was, I don't know why.
Mike Harris was not a Kitchener-Conestoga resident at the time that he ran in 2018.
He's been here long enough.
Yeah,
but all that about the farmland and all that, you'd think something would change.
Yeah.
But I don't think it is.
Yeah. So in that case, I don't think there's much of a chance of a large split. We have a candidate in Kitchener-Conestoga, Joe Gowing, who's run as a Liberal candidate provincially before. So he's got some name recognition there. Of course, Mike Harris Jr. has the name recognition and the name confusion from Michael Harris, who was the MPP before him. No relation. And of course, his father, Mike Harris Sr., who was the Premier of Ontario for a while. And then the NDP candidate, Jody Szymanski, who's apparently put on a fairly good campaign.
I was impressed. I heard them on the radio. Not Mike Harris, of course, because he doesn't show up. But when you hear those candidates, and also I think I heard this morning that the Green candidate has also said vote for NDP this time.
In Kitchener-Conestoga?
Yep.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
That's what I heard.
I wonder how that's going to go over with the party head office. I can't see that this is something that's been endorsed by the party itself. It was supporting another candidate from a different party.
I don't. It's the nature of parties. It's almost like like betraying what you are, right? I mean, basically, I wish there was room for. I mean, there should be a green movement rather than a party, and you build it up that way, and you could actually have them side by side. A movement. You can influence that. You can try to get people with a good perspective to become candidates in the other parties. And you could also, go where encourage the consensus and all of that. You have so much more influence that way than by going that old-fashioned political party. I separate. It's very kind of Protestant, like, whereas there's a Catholic aspect. We're all it's universal, right?
Right. I think that there's some movement like that in Waterloo Region. There's Green Waterloo Region as an organization, which is an amalgamation of a number of different environmental groups. I think Nith Valley Eco Boosters may be in there. It's Kevin Thomason who's heading that up.
He's amazing, and they have it's a network of the entire Grand River watershed.
Yes,
and I think that's really interesting. And I was interested that Cooperate for Canada also treats the watershed as a district of Ontario, and to me that's progress.
Yes, base it on actual the things that actually influence and make our lives better, what our lives depend on, rather than these artificial boundaries that
exactly those. I mean, you have to be local, otherwise there's limits, right? Mm-hmm. But the limits of the watershed were set by geological time.
Exactly.
And we can't argue about them.
Exactly.
So that's why I like them.
And we're dependent on that, and it's what's causing us to it's what makes us come to the area here. It's the river, the transportation. At the time, I don't know that the river is a great avenue for transportation any longer, but that's certainly what caused a lot of the settlement along here.
And when you do your land acknowledgement, it's the Haldeman Tract. All those things are the river, and I think it's also a reminder that we're here on the ground. We're all of us are standing on the ground. There aren't levels of government. Ontario is just a broader ground. It's not that it's upper tier or higher tier. Because that's something we didn't talk about, and it doesn't get discussed in the election either. But the relationship between our levels of democratic representation. Here we have two local, the so-called upper and lower, and then provincial and federal. How those interrelate is a mess. And that, to me, is the number one issue. More so than reform of voting and all of that. I think we've got to sort all that out. And I think, but that's also, I think the cities at first were doing quite a bit of saying it's actually municipalities that should be the election campaign because everything depends on them. And again, our province is indictable on that front. They've made a mess of that too.
Yeah. So will you be advocating then for a flattening of the electoral structure, possibly a federal government, but no longer provincial, regional, and municipal, and just having one large government for the watershed area?
No, I don't think so. I'm not an amalgamationist at all.
Okay.
In fact,
you're still my friend then.
I also make very important to me is the difference between the center of the city and the suburbs. They're just totally different. And everything that was built before 1950 has a certain character that's built into how it was laid out and how it was actually physically built. And that's different than the suburbs. And if you respect the difference rather than try to sort of melt everything into one, you are making a step forward, because there are different considerations here than there are like density and things like that.
Yeah, and not just the suburbs and the urban cores, but also the rural areas that we have here in our region.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. That's another, and they're different, right?
Very much different.
And
yes.
if you make them all into one, it just gets, you can't speak for yourself. You can't legislate for, it just messes everything up.
On the other hand, do you want to divide that? Do you want to have separate rural ridings from urban ridings and create yet more division in the electoral system that way?
Well, I don't have a formula. I think about it a lot, and I really care about constituencies, and there are ways we could do it, but I don't have the formula. It should be that if you mix it up, I mean, particularly when you have 51% rules, tyranny of the plurality is a terrible thing, and you have to offset that somehow. You have to think about the fact that people live inside the inner cities, they're a minority, so therefore you have to protect that to some extent.
They're a minority in geographical representation. They're not necessarily a minority in the number of the population. So in Waterloo Region, for example, the urban cores are a small fraction of the land area in the region.
Absolutely.
And so where should the proportional representation lie? In the amount of area that is being represented, or in the number of people that are residing in those areas? Because then you get concentration of power within the urban cores, generally to the detriment of the agricultural areas.
Yeah. No, it shouldn't be that way either, right?
No. So this is tough. You'll have to come back, and we'll have to talk about doing electoral reform on a geographic basis at some point.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. I don't have a formula, but I think about it. One of the things I think would be really good, why don't we have here gerrymandering? It's because at a certain point we handed over responsibility for deciding what the boundaries of each electoral district are going to be to a body that has nothing to do with political parties, or they're given certain instructions. You have to make sure that it's sort of, there's things you have to trade off, and they have to find configurations. I think we should also hand this whole issue of electoral reform to that kind of body and set the criteria and do it that way rather than make it a political issue. Because the politicians, to reform themselves, there's too many opposite interests and whatnot. No one can ever speak for all of them. But yet, doing the right thing, it's possible to articulate what the right thing might be for representing us.
Okay. More conversations to be had at a future date.
Absolutely.
Martin de Groot, thank you so much for coming out.
It's been a pleasure.
It has been fun. You need to do this more often. You need to have a regular political show on CKMS.
Yeah.
Because we certainly don't have that. Martin de Groot is the host of Home Range Promenade, an arts and culture magazine, I suppose is what that would be.
Community radio magazine, that's what I call it.
Community radio magazine.
And the topic is projects, under things people do. Because I know arts and culture so well, it usually ends up being arts projects. But
yeah, airs on CKMS FM at 6 o'clock on Monday evenings, and I believe on Midtown Radio at 7 p.m. on Monday evenings. Martin, thank you again for coming on. You've been listening to Meet the Candidate. Today has been our election analysis episode. Just want to remind you that the views expressed were those of Martin de Groot and myself, Bob Jonkman, not necessarily those of the Radio Waterloo Board of Directors, volunteers, sponsors, or advertisers. Voting Day is Thursday, 2 days from now. Go out and vote if you haven't done so in the advance polls already. It is important. The future of Ontario hangs in the balance. My name is Bob Jonkman. We'll see you again at the next election. Bye, Martin.
bye-bye.